there's a lot more to food than what meets the fork. But sometimes you have to take things with a grain of salt. Tonight, we get hungry for love. Is chocolate the secret key to her heart? Was the first wedding cake a pie? And do oysters really get us going? Are they old wives' tales, ancient elixirs, or just clever marketing ploys? Every bite you take has a story, every morsel a myth. Is it baked with fact or flavored with fiction? Whether it's breakfast in bed or a romantic dinner, food and the mood go hand in hand. And nothing sets hearts aflutter like the rich, sweet preparation of the cacao bean that we've all come to love. Give your sweetheart chocolate, and romance is soon to follow. Does chocolate really lead to love? The story of chocolate began thousands of years ago in Central America, where the cacao tree is native. Aztecs believed this divine delight came from the god of wisdom, and who can argue with that? But when did chocolate become an erotic edible? According to food historian Sarah Lohman, chocolate wasn't always a candy. It began as a cocktail.
We know that there were pre-Columbian Mesoamerican cultures drinking chocolate because we can look at ancient pots and look at the chemical signature left behind in those pots and be able to trace it to different cultures who used it.
These ancient confectioners would toast and grind cacao seeds and spike them with honey and flowers. Sounds like ancient cocoa was all about the birds and the bees.
And then chocolate was always froth. So this was traditionally done by pouring it back and forth between two vessels. There are images both from the Maya and the Aztec cultures of women doing this, preparing the chocolate. I'm probably not going to be as good at this as they are, but I'm going to give it a shot. We can do this all day if you want.
It's like a waterfall in an ancient chocolate factory. After it was frothed, they served the drink hot or cold.
It's actually pretty good.
Legend has it that the ancient Mayans used their steamy, creamy concoction as an aphrodisiac. And in the 1400s, the Aztec Emperor Montezuma is said to have consumed copious amounts of cocoa to fuel his romantic encounters. It was supposed to be good for your health and give you endurance. We don't know if the love potion worked, but Christopher Columbus liked it enough to bring the brew back to Spain. Spanish nobles added sugar, and hot chocolate as we now know it was born. But it took some tinkering before the chocolate bar came along and made its way into the bedroom.
So for most of human history, chocolate was a drink. But once it came to Europe, people started experimenting with how to make it into a solid.
Chocolatiers around Europe tried and failed to turn sweet liquid chocolate into a sweet solid bar for decades, but they couldn't get the taste quite right. That all changed in the 1870s, thanks to an accident in the kitchen of Swiss chocolatier Rudolf Lindt.
It was not an accident.
So the problem with the first chocolate bars is that they were very gritty, bitter, and very, very sour. That was a quality from the cacao beans. There are these mechanized chocolate grinders would grind the chocolate, and a chocolate maker named Lindt accidentally left his chocolate grinder on for days. And when he came back to it, he thought, this is going to be a waste, this chocolate's going to be ruined, and it turns out it was perfect.
All that grinding emulsified the chocolate, which released the acids that made it sour and bitter. Lindt ended up with a solid chocolate that was smooth and sweet. The melt-in-your-mouth chocolate bar was finally born. In the next few years, condensed milk was added, creating a creamy, rich texture. But love and chocolate didn't hook up until a hopeless romantic came up with a brilliant marketing scheme. How did one man make our hearts melt with chocolate? And is there scientific proof that this sweet treat makes us swoon? Find out when Food, Fact or Fiction returns. Nothing says I love you quite like chocolate, except perhaps the phrase I love you. But how did the love affair between chocolate and romance begin? Like any relationship, the recipe for chocolate is a complex one. It takes just the right ingredients to make it work. Same goes for a good marketing campaign. In the mid-19th century, British chocolate manufacturer Richard Cadbury realized he could capitalize on a certain craze: British couples showering each other with lavish gifts, cards, and love letters on Valentine's Day.
It was Cadbury, famous chocolate maker in England, that was the first one to put delicate little truffles in heart-shaped boxes and recommended that the boxes be kept to store your love letters in.
Yes, these are the boxes that single ladies get and the married ones dream of.
Across the pond, Americans got busy too. Buying Cadbury chocolate boxes, that is. Love and the bonbon have been romantically linked ever since. But what does science have to say? Was Cadbury's success a stroke of luck? Or is it possible he was actually onto something? Neuroscientist Paul Zak, aka Dr. Love, may have the answer. He believes the link between chocolate and romance has to do with something in the brain called oxytocin.
Oxytocin is the key brain chemical that makes us care about other people. And oxytocin makes people more empathic, more compassionate, more generous, more trustworthy.
Dr. Zak calls this the moral molecule, a chemical that bonds people together and increases with affection. Could chocolate send your oxytocin into overdrive? Dr. Zak designed an experiment with some lovebirds to find out.
In this experiment, for the first time, we want to see if eating chocolate with your loved one would cause the brain to make oxytocin.
Dr. Zak and his research team attached sensors to the subjects to measure spikes in oxytocin and arousal responses in the brain and heart.
So we designed an experiment with two conditions. The control condition is your loved one giving you a plain cracker. So we see just what happens when you eat something normal. And the second condition, the treatment condition that we care about, is when your loved one gives you a piece of wonderful dark chocolate. What happens in your brain when you eat that chocolate that's endowed with love?
When Dr. Zak compares the cracker data with the chocolate data, his findings are pretty solid.
This is the data on eating a cracker, and we see this lack of engagement. Crackers are not very interesting. Now, if I compare that to what happens when we eat chocolate, we see that the brain is digging chocolate from your loved one. We see a higher heart rate all the way through. We're getting this oxytocin effect where I feel cared for, and I'm also a bit aroused. So I think of chocolate as a route right to your heart. Right? It's really showing us that chocolate lets us connect to others, not just through eating it, but through the gift of love.
And those are the facts of life. Chocolate and love are biologically proven to be a match made in heaven. Oh, cut it out, you two. Brits and Yanks aren't the only ones who celebrate Valentine's Day with chocolate. The tradition has spread around the world. But did something get lost in translation and cause a major romantic mix-up in Japan? Next on Food, Fact or Fiction. Did you know that in Japan, they celebrate Valentine's Day with an accidental twist? Japanese chocolate makers adopted the Western tradition of selling heart-shaped chocolates for Valentine's Day in the 1930s. But legend has it, a translation error declared it a day for women to confess their love to men by giving them chocolate. The tradition stuck. A sweet deal for the guys. But take heart, ladies. To correct the mistake, Japan invented White Day just 1 month later on March 14th, when guys give the gals white chocolates or marshmallows. It's the most important guest at almost any wedding in America. Not the father of the bride, not the best man, maybe not even the groom. The wedding cake. Marriage is an ancient ritual, but the wedding cake hasn't always been a piece of the romantic pie. So why do we eat cake at weddings? When New Yorkers want a wedding cake, those in the know come here. Baked in New York City. According to owner Renato Pogliafito, every wedding cake he sells is rich with history.
A lot of us eat cake at a wedding and usually don't think twice about it, but it actually has a very storied history. And I think couples should know about this before taking the plunge.
Throughout the ages, weddings have been celebrated with some sort of edible treat, but it wasn't always as delicious as cake. In ancient Rome, couples entered marital bliss with a loaf of bread that was broken over the bride's head. The guests would throw breadcrumbs at the happy couple for good luck, much like we do with rice today. This future bride and groom are looking for the wedding cake of their dreams. but a baguette isn't exactly what they have in mind.
Don't you dare.
Renato shares a different slice of wedding cake history, because after the bread came a pie.
Brides' pies were for the rich, and they were large and elaborately decorated crusts, and they were filled with delicacies like sweetbreads and oysters. There was a humbler, less expensive pie that contained minced meat or mutton. Each guest had to eat a slice, and if you didn't, it was considered bad manners, but actually even worse, it was considered bad luck.
Minced meat wasn't the only thing in the wedding pie. Hidden in each pastry was a button or a ring. If a guest found a button, it meant spinsterhood or bachelorhood for life. But a ring meant marriage within the year. Either way, it probably meant a trip to the dentist. So how did we go from bread to pie to tall white wedding cakes? According to legend, a baker's apprentice in 18th century London fell head over heels in love. He dreamed up an extravagant cake based on the spire of St. Bride's Church. Thus, wedding cakes got a facelift, but better ingredients improved their inner beauty.
So refined sugars and flours made it possible for wedding cakes to be lighter, taller, and whiter. White icing actually became a symbol for the bride's purity.
So how did white wedding cakes go from symbols of purity to the elaborate creations we know today? In the U.S., it was largely due to a small affair. In the 19th century, all of America toasted the wedding of P.T. Barnum's star attraction, Tom Thumb. President Lincoln even invited the newlyweds to the White House.
His wedding cake was crazy. It had an Egyptian temple, seashells, angels, columns. It was so over the top that a slice was donated to the Library of Congress.
100 years on, wedding cakes come in all sizes, shapes, and flavors. But for this couple, Renato has baked something classic. Vanilla on vanilla. The wedding cake itself has evolved over time, but the tradition has remained the same. To share something special with family and friends for good luck and a long, happy life. But I'll take chocolate over mutton pie any day. After the happy couple enjoys their cake, it's on to another renowned tradition, the honeymoon. But did the honeymoon ever actually involve honey? Next on Food, Fact or Fiction. Find out the truth behind more food myths at cookingchanneltv.com/fact or fiction. The wedding might be the main event for newlyweds, but the honeymoon is where the action is. But why do we call them honeymoons? Some experts say that in the 5th century, newlyweds drank a honey-infused wine called mead during the first moon of marriage to help get them in the mood. And happy couples have been honeymooning ever since. Speaking of getting in the mood, oysters. They're slimy, salty, and, depending on your taste, delicious. Or not so much. There's something else oysters are known for, putting us in the mood. Are oysters really an aphrodisiac? These sea creatures that grow in their own beds are famous for making us want to hop into ours. Oysters have had an erotic reputation for ages. They were the symbol of the Greek goddess Aphrodite, who rose from the sea on an oyster shell and immediately gave birth to a son. The ancient Romans were the first to label them aphrodisiacs back in the 2nd century, and Roman women who ate oysters were thought to be scandalous. Casanova, the most famous ladies' man of all time, supposedly ate 60 raw oysters every morning for breakfast. In America, oysters earned their racy reputation in the sexiest city of all, New York. Wild oyster diver Chris Anderson knows where the seductive secrets of oysters are buried. He's taking a deep dive in the Hudson River, back to a time when the Big Apple was known as the Big Oyster.
Manhattan, I would say, was actually built on oysters. We used to have 350 square miles of oyster reefs here. That means lots and lots of oysters growing on top of each other, creating these thick oyster beds. We were the #1 oyster exporter in the world.
When we think of oysters today, we think of champagne and pearls. Back in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, these slimy shooters fed the entire population of New York, both rich and poor.
So now we have hot dog stands. We didn't always have hot dog stands. Before hot dogs, there were oysters. Before Ellis Island and Liberty Island were known as those names, Ellis was known as Oyster Island, and Liberty Island was known as Big Oyster Island.
New York City's connection to oysters runs very deep. Want proof? Just keep your eyes on the ground.
Well, New York City streets used to be paved with oysters, and it probably looked not unlike what you see here. These are actual lime-based oysters that are in this pavement. New York City used to be completely covered with oyster shells.
Did all that oyster slurping in early New York lead to some hot and heavy lip smacking?
Toward the end of the 18th century and for much of the 19th century, men would visit what were called oyster cellars. And these were locations in the city where you could walk down the stairs into an establishment and you could eat oysters, and you could also visit prostitutes. You would be able to have two of your vices in one spot. New York City became famous for those two items, and they were the #1 exports in all of the city. Men found these oyster cellars by looking for red lanterns. They would follow the red lantern, walk down the stairs, and find prostitutes and oysters.
Wild oyster beds pretty much disappeared from Manhattan in the 1920s, but as new oyster farms have popped up around the country, our love affair with the mouth-watering mollusk has endured. From housewives to hipsters. Americans now consume 2.5 billion oysters every year, and they remain a favorite among New Yorkers. Today's trendy oyster bars are big business, even without the brothels. It seems like their seductive reputation has survived the ages. But what's the scientific skinny on oysters? Is there something inside that shell that actually turns us on? Oysters contain zinc, which is known to increase fertility in men. And lab tests have shown that shellfish contain amino acids that cause a slight increase in sexual hormones. But is it enough to actually boost the human libido?
The actual act of doing it is so sexy.
And it's salty and creamy.
I would say yes.
Just the act of slurping the oyster.
It's true.
You know, that's sexy in itself, so.
You're drawing attention to your mouth. You're drawing attention to your face expression, your hand.
Yeah.
It becomes a little sexual.
In order to attain the zinc levels necessary to really affect your testosterone, you might have to ingest possibly thousands of these oysters, and I think you might get sick before that would ever have any benefit in the bedroom. It's probably more of a psychological effect than anything.
The legend of oysters and sex is all in our minds. Ah, shucks. Well, at least now we have those little blue pills. We've discovered that chocolate really can be the way to your lover's heart, that today's extravagant wedding cake evolved from a simple meat pie, and that a bed of oysters may not lead to a bed of roses. No meal is complete without a spoonful of fact and a dash of fiction.